just east of Niagara Falls in northwest New York State, an area with the deceptively serene name of Love Canal turned out to be one of America's most notorious toxic waste horror stories. An inadequate cover on a chemical company's dump site allowed a deadly brew of toxins to leak into a suburban neighborhood. A public health scare erupted.
Can you make decisions? Are you going to live there with your wife? Are you going to put your kids there?
Over 900 families left their homes. Several years and hundreds of millions of dollars had to be spent to try to stop the further spread of the contaminants. The Love Canal originally got its name from entrepreneur William T. Love. In 1894, he began construction on a man-made canal that he envisioned would link the Niagara River to Lake Ontario.
His plan was to use the power of the river as it rushes towards the falls, diverting it before it goes over the falls, and carrying it north through a canal, which would wind up at this escarpment or cliff and pour down and provide the power that's necessary to generate electricity.
The canal was essentially a trench dug in the clay soil of the area. After only 3,000 feet were excavated, a pair of unforeseen events brought construction to a halt.
One was the depression of the 1890s, severe depression. Secondly was somebody named Tesla devised a way to have alternating current instead of direct current, so you didn't have to be right on top of the source of power.
Alternating current made it unnecessary to develop industry and Love's planned city adjacent to his canal. For the next several years, Love's unfinished canal served as a summer swimming hole for nearby residents. Then in 1942, Hooker Chemical Company acquired the canal.
They ended up using the property as a pretty much a 16-acre hole in the ground at that point, 3,000 feet long by 80 feet wide to 100 feet wide, probably anywhere from 8 to 15 or 20 feet in depth. And they used it for disposal of industrial waste from a period of time from about 1942 to 1952 or 53.
By 1953, the canal was filled with over 20,000 tons of chemical wastes, including caustic solvents and pesticides. Hooker had no further use for the canal, and with no regulations in place to stop them at the time, they simply covered the dump site with a layer of clay and soil from the area. Soon grass grew and helped hide what festered just a few feet below.
Of course, everybody played on that area because it's not a canal, it's covered over. And sometimes kids would their feet would get irritated from running around in the canal.
As Niagara Falls' growing population spread, the New York Board of Education was looking for inexpensive land and expressed interest in the property Hooker owned. The chemical company offered to sell the no longer useful land for $1. The deed did contain a warning about the contents of the canal, but that did not stop the sale.
Well, they didn't build the school directly on top of the canal. They built a playground there. And on the black top of the playground, there was like a percolation of a taffy-like watery substance coming out of the ground into this playground.
At around the same time, there continued to be increased development in the area. A series of homes went up around the canal. None of the homes were built right on the canal. They were adjacent to it.
And then a lot of residents complained of not only smells in their basement, but of oozing of the similar types of chemicals into those sub pumps, into the drainage ditches around their basements.
The leachate that was found throughout the Love Canal community was generally a black goop, to use a technical, non-technical term. It was a very thick black material. It was very oily based. It almost looked like a tar-like material. It was more watery in some instances than in others.
Those who had bought homes in the area hadn't been warned in their deeds of what was beneath the grassy field. For new residents like Lois Gibbs, something was clearly wrong. In 1977, her son began attending the 99th Street School.
I just remember after living at Love Canal for a while, Michael got sick. And he kept getting new diseases. He had asthma, liver problems, immune system problem, urinary tract disorder, which required 2 operations to correct. I mean, it was just like one thing after the other. And I could not figure out what was wrong with him.
Around this time, A newspaper reporter wrote a story about the canal and what was buried in it. Now the residents had an explanation for the mysterious substances and illnesses, and Lois Gibbs decided something had to be done.
First, she tried to have her child transferred out of the school, and they told her that they wouldn't do it because there was no problem. There was no chemical problem there. And so she started going up and down the street, talking to people, talking to neighbors, asking if they were interested in joining a little group that would try to get the school cleaned up.
Awareness of the problem and complaints from the residents became much more widespread after the winter of 1977.
It was the precipitation event, the blizzard of '77, that actually overfilled the canal, the bathtub effect, with all of the winter snow, etc., and the actual wet season that we had in 1977 after this blizzard. We had an early spring, an early thaw, and all the water was forced underneath the canal from this clay pit, basically, to the top, and it started oozing out of the top of the canal.
In the late 1970s, there were no conclusive answers about the health risks and long-term effects of exposure to toxic wastes. Nobody was really sure what wastes were in the canal, but deadly dioxin was identified. The Environmental Protection Agency had been formed just a few years earlier and had not dealt with a public crisis like this before. The residents' fear turned to frustration and anger. The Love Canal became the focus of the growing environmental movement and was soon national news. On August 7, 1978, then-President Jimmy Carter declared Love Canal a disaster area, and those living nearest to the dump site were relocated.
Right after the first relocation in August of 1978, they erected a 10-foot fence, a green fence, so it would be environmentally pleasant around Love Canal. And then they put signs on the fence that said, hazardous area, dangerous, do not enter.
Infrared pictures were taken from the air to track the spread of the contaminants. Gray or black in the photos revealed the presence of the chemical waste. After another 2 years of activism by Lois Gibbs and other residents, a second presidential declaration cleared the way for another 500 families to be relocated. Except for a few families who refused to move, Love Canal became a ghost town. Continuing studies revealed the contents of the canal.
There were over 400 chemicals found in the leachate from the Love Canal landfill, from lead and arsenic to lindane, variety of other pesticides, to solvents such as benzene, toluene, xylene, host of others. Many of these chemicals cause cancer. Many of them cause liver problems, liver disease. Many of them cause central nervous system problems. Some cause birth defects.
Over the next few years, extensive efforts were made to clean up the neighborhood.
We cleaned 65,000 lineal feet of storm sewers around that entire area. And of course, the hazardous waste byproducts did find their way underground to a nearby set of creeks, the Black and Burkholz creeks that flow just north of Love Canal. We ended up testing the creek sediment and discovering that the same hazardous waste byproducts that were buried now have worked their way via water under the ground to the creek areas. One of the remedies were to actually dredge the creek.
Crews dealing with the toxic dump itself decided that trying to remove, transport, and store the chemicals somewhere else was inviting further disaster. The chemicals were going to have to stay where they were, and a better cover and containment system put in place. The 99th Street School and 239 homes were demolished and placed on top of the canal, and then covered with clay.
And over the top of it, we placed this synthetic liner, and this synthetic liner went directly over the entire 40-acre area, okay? And then after we placed the synthetic liner, we then installed this plastic liner. This liner goes over the entire 40-acre area. So when it rains, all of the precipitation will go through the ground and will actually hit the top of this liner, much like an umbrella. It will run off of it.
The runoff is then collected in an underground barrier drain system. It's then pumped up to the facility at the top of the Love Canal, where it's treated by carbon filters.
It is then discharged via storm sewer to the City of Niagara Falls' wastewater treatment plant, where it undergoes more filtration before clean water is discharged into the upper Niagara River.
The capping and drainage system handles the material so well that anything that gets through is minimal. And we have a series of over 200 monitoring wells in the entire neighborhood to make sure that the groundwater is not being impacted by any of the contamination.
It's been more than a quarter of a century since the Love Canal first became a notorious environmental disaster. New residents have been moving into the area, but many of those who lived there previously will never consider it safe.
This is the Earth. The Earth shifts. And we saw what happened in the blizzard of '77 when we had the snow melt and the river rose, and that, they believe, created a lot of the Love Canal problem. It's foolish to think that they can contain it.
The crisis at Love Canal created greater awareness of America's growing problem with industrial wastes. It was also primarily responsible for the creation of a federal program called Superfund. Since its inception in 1980, Superfund has spent more than $16 billion cleaning up over 2,000 hazardous waste sites around the United States, including the infamous Love Canal.
On themselves.
I carried a child for 9 months. Our little Julie was stillborn. The loss of our child may be a direct result to the chemicals. Please don't allow this to happen to anyone else before you get them out. Don't let it happen to yourselves.
Pollutants and toxic chemicals grew out of a bright and shiny vision of civilization. It was an age of miracles. The rise of modern chemistry brought new synthetic wonders. But it had a dark side. DDT had saved millions in the fight against malaria. However, it proved lethal to wildlife. The first to sound the alarm was Rachel Carson, whose book Silent Spring set off widespread concern and controversy.
Ms. Carson maintains that the balance of nature is a major force in the survival of man, whereas the modern chemist, the modern scientist, believes that man is steadily controlling nature.
Now, to these people, apparently the balance of nature was something that was repealed as soon as man came on the scene.
People were finding from Rachel Carson and others about DDT and other poisons that were getting into their food. The chemical industry was unregulated. Raw sewage was going right down the Hudson River. Air pollution was growing just as fast as new automobiles were coming out. You had steel mills belching out whatever it was they belched out, and all of a sudden people said, wait a second, this is not how we have to live.
Why can't we get any decent drinking water in this town anymore?
If you visit American City, you will find it very pretty. Just two things of which you must beware. Don't drink the water and don't breathe the air.
Hey, you kids, don't you know better than swim in there? That water's polluted. Now come on out of there before you get sick.
Pollution, pollution, we got smog and sewage and mud. Turn on your tap and get hot and cold running crud.
The great question of the 70s is, shall we surrender to our surroundings, or shall we make our peace with nature and begin to make reparations for the damage we have done to our air, to our land, and to our water?
Earth Day created a tide so strong that it swept up both Republicans and Democrats. It launched the second wave of environmentalism, marked by a series of landmark environmental protection laws, the creation of the EPA, strengthening of the Clean Air Act, expanding the Clean Water Act, passing the Endangered Species Act, and creating Superfund to control toxic waste. Cleaning up the environment came down to issuing regulations and enforcing them. Rising to the challenge were a new breed of lawyers, equally adept at working with the government or suing them.
Once these regulations were put in, lawyers were able to become the enforcers of these laws. We helped write the regulations, and then we sued the government if they didn't live up to the regulations, and we sued the polluters if they violated those laws.
All of a sudden, industrial America realizes that this is a fundamental threat to the way they do business. And they came back with a very powerful counterattack. We went in to pass a new Clean Air Act. The industrial lobbyists said, look, these old factories, we're going to shut them down in a few years. It doesn't make sense to make them clean up. Make the new stuff be clean. And let us just retire the old stuff. The environmental community didn't really want to take that deal, but we took it. And what happened is they didn't build new factories, and they didn't clean up the old ones either. They just kept operating the old ones dirty. My generation of environmentalists made a fundamental strategic error. Most of the really bad new ideas of the last half of the 20th century, we were able to stop. What we failed to do was to replace the toxic industrial infrastructure and the toxic industrial processes of the first half of the 20th century.
The issue of toxic waste began bubbling up at a place called Love Canal. It was neither the first nor the worst toxic waste dump. What made the difference was the people of Love Canal, led by Lois Gibbs.
You are murderers! Each and every one of you in this room are murderers!
When Love Canal came, it was a new segment of the movement. It wasn't that we don't care about the forest. It was the people focus that set us aside from the other elements that had come before us, and really the focus on if the fish are dying and if the birds are dying, then we're going to die.
Buried beneath the neighborhood were 20,000 tons of poisonous chemicals dumped in an old canal by Hooker Chemical Corporation. Reports of trouble began in 1976, but Love Canal did not explode until Michael Brown, a journalist at the Niagara Gazette, wrote articles exposing the problem. They caught the eye of Lois Gibbs.
I read a newspaper article, and Love Canal had 20,000 tons of chemicals buried in it, and that it was leaking into the neighborhood. And so I read this newspaper, and I said, oh, those poor people. The next day, there was another article, and in that one it talked about the 99th Street Elementary School, and I was like, oh my goodness. That's where Michael's going to kindergarten. That's why Michael's so sick.
Lois tried to get her son transferred to another school, but the superintendent refused.
When I met with Dr. Long, he said, I am not about to move 407 children because of one irate, hysterical housewife with a sickly kid.
Instead, Lois began to circulate a petition to close the school. She went door to door, discovering the extent of the damage.
I was shocked. I was absolutely shocked. I thought I was the only one with a sickly child. I thought I was the only family that was affected by these leaking chemicals from Love Canal. In their basement, you could see where the chemical residue just comes up through the basement floor and just pools there, and it smells. It smells like a chemical factory. It's nasty.
This hole just popped up, and this is what we feel is causing a lot of the birth defects and the miscarriages and health problems in the area.
In '76, it was before Love Canal broke, I got pregnant. I carried the child for 9 months. The baby weighed 3 pounds and was stillborn birth.
I've had 2 miscarriages. I had a miscarriage living in this house, and I had a miscarriage when I worked for Hooker Chemical. My God, I almost panicked. I couldn't believe it. Both my children were born premature.
When Lois took her case to the state, officials surprised her with an emergency declaration to evacuate the nearest homes. However, the outer ring of homes surrounding Love Canal, 800 families were given nothing.
Would you please tell me, do I let my 3-year-old stay? She has a birth defect now.
What are you going to do for my kids? What are you going to do? Nothing. The damage is done, man. The damage is done.
The state bought the inner ring of houses. Then they put up a fence and began to excavate. Love Canal residents outside the fence felt trapped.
When did the state tell you to stop growing your vegetable garden? In August of '78. So they weren't willing to move you out, but they were willing to tell you to stop growing vegetables.
Willing to tell us not to have the kids go barefooted, not to have them go in the basement. Don't plant a garden, but enjoy your house. Live there with your family while we continue doing our tests and use you as guinea pigs.
The Love Canal residents decided to do their own health study and found an alarming increase in disease and birth defects.
We truly believed if we can prove that there is an increase in disease, they, meaning the government, will do the right thing. And we found that 56% of the children in our community were born with birth defects. 56% of our children had 3 ears, double rows of teeth, extra fingers, extra toes, or were mentally retarded. During that study time, there were 22 women who were pregnant, and of those 22 pregnancies, only 4 normal babies were born. And the health department literally threw the health study on the floor. I mean, literally took it and just threw it on the floor and said, it's useless housewife data collected by people who have a vested interest in the outcome.
The New York State Health Department was prodded into doing its own health study and presented their findings to a packed meeting in Love Canal.
The health commissioner took the stage and said, we found that 56% of the children in Love Canal were born with birth defects. And we're secretly, as sick as it sounds, saying, yes, yes, and now you're going to evacuate us, right? I mean, that's what we're hoping for. And then he says, but we don't believe those birth defects are related to Love Canal. And it's just the whole audience, you could hear, huh? I mean, it was just like, and it's like, we believe that those birth defects are related to a random clustering of genetically defective people.
I'm getting tired of them weeping. I'm getting tired of them screaming. I'm getting tired of them all waking me up in the middle of the night. There is poison in the well. Everybody's going to hell. There is poison in the well. Dead man downtown.
For the residents, Love Canal became a 2-year struggle to get relocated. Lois Gibbs pushed relentlessly and finally forced the state to bring in the federal government. The Environmental Protection Agency launched a pilot study of chromosome damage. The results of the tests were explosive.
Chromosome damage means my 2 children may be genetically damaged as a result of Love Canal. That was the straw that broke the camel's back.
We will then decide whether this evidence, added to the cumulative knowledge that we already have from other health and environmental studies at Love Canal, justifies a recommendation for relocation of the residents or other appropriate actions to assist those in the area.
It seems to me that the federal government has finally, after 2 years, come up to the high-level thinking of housewives that they have constantly put down. We know what's going on. We did research too, and we want out of there. We want our kids out.
Not on Wednesday, today.
The EPA recommended relocation, but the White House blocked the emergency declaration. The residents of Love Canal demanded an explanation. When EPA officials arrived, they decided to take them hostage.
Just pass the word around. Nobody, we're not going to do anything violent. We're just going to keep them in the house. Nothing more than that. Body barricade the doors. Okay?
Okay, pass the word.
And don't let them out. All right, nobody else. No one's coming out, guys. Sit. If I was to let the two EPA representatives come out this door, does anybody know what would happen to them?
I guess I'm here for the duration.
Meaning what, the duration?
Well, I guess until the White House gives the homeowners some sort of answer.
I called up the White House. The lady started giving me this lecture about how Love Canal residents have blown it out of proportion and lots of people die of cancer and we should just, I'm like, you know, lady, if I was a crazy, I'd kill these hostages. And I hung up the phone. I'm thinking, like, I am crazy.
Homeowners Association President Lois Gibbs spoke with Congressman John LaFalce in Washington to try to get some answers. LaFalce is set to meet with President Carter at this hour at a dinner meeting at the White House. We should have more information tonight.
I went out on the front porch and said, okay, guys, the president hears us. He's going to hear from our congressman. I think we should let them go, and I think we should let them go with a very strong warning.
I have told the White House, and this is upon your approval, that we will allow the two EPA representatives to leave. But if we do not have a disaster declaration Wednesday by noon, then what they have seen here today is just a Sesame Street picnic in comparison.
2 days later, Lois called the White House. Amazingly enough, her ultimatum worked.
An emergency to permit the federal government and the state of New York to undertake...
And then all of a sudden she said, and we will grant temporary relocation. I'm like, and we'll grant temporary relocation. All of a sudden it was just like, even the birds, I swear, weren't singing until we can get permanent relocation money allocated. But permanent relocation is the goal.
Here's to the homeowners and all their hard work. You get
At last, President Carter came to Love Canal to sign the agreement buying out the homeowners.
The whole question of the disposal of hazardous waste, especially toxic chemicals, is going to be one of the great environmental challenges of the 1980s. There must never be in our country another Love Canal. Thank you very much.